He dropped to one knee for the wrong woman in front of an entire station full of people, and only seconds later did he realize the truth. The woman he meant to propose to was standing behind him, and she was the one who had already saved everything he owned. The noon train hadn't even fully come to a stop when Ethan Cole felt his pulse hammering like a runaway horse, his fingers tightening around the small velvet box in his palm, as if letting go meant losing more than just a ring. It meant losing the last fragile piece of control he had over a life that had been unraveling for months. Red Hollow Station buzzed with its usual low murmur of travelers and traders, boots scraping wood, voices overlapping in dusty air. But to Ethan, it all felt distant, blurred behind the weight of what he was about to do. Because 3 months ago his ranch had been on the brink of collapse. Fences broken, cattle sick, debts piling faster than he could count, and the kind of pressure that didn't just threaten land but crushed a man's pride along with it. And then the letters had started arriving, each one steady, practical, never overly warm but never cold either, signed with a name that had slowly become his anchor. Clara Whitmore. She had sent advice first. Sharp and specific, things only someone who understood ranching could know. Then came the money at just the right moment. Not enough to insult him, but enough to keep him afloat. Followed by arrangements he never asked for, but desperately needed. Workers showing up claiming they'd been hired. Feed shipments arriving before shortages turned critical. Even a legal notice resolving a land dispute he hadn't told anyone about. And through it all, those letters, always calm, always certain, like someone standing just out of sight holding the entire structure together while he struggled not to fall apart. And somewhere in those sleepless nights and early mornings, reading her words by lantern light, Ethan had built a picture of her in his mind, not just as a savior of his ranch, but as someone who understood him in a way no one else ever had. So when he learned she'd be arriving on the noon train, it didn't feel impulsive to plan a proposal. It felt inevitable, like finishing something that had already begun long ago, like finally stepping into a future that had quietly been forming without him realizing it. And now here he was, standing among strangers who had no idea they were about to witness the most important moment of his life. His boots planted firm but his thoughts racing, until the train finally screeched to a halt and the doors opened with a hiss that seemed louder than it should have been, releasing a stream of passengers into the sun. Women in traveling dresses, men carrying worn bags, faces unfamiliar and uninterested. Until he saw her. She stepped down with composed grace, wearing exactly what the letters had described once in passing, a pale blue dress, gloves neatly fitted, posture straight, her presence calm in a way that immediately matched the voice he had come to know through ink and paper. And without giving himself time to doubt, Ethan moved forward, each step faster than the last, his heartbeat drowning out every other sound as he reached her. Just as her boots touched the platform, and before hesitation could creep in, before logic could question anything, he spoke her name, Clara, his voice rough but certain, and then he dropped to one knee, the motion so sudden it pulled gasps from those nearby. Conversations cutting off mid-sentence as heads turned and silence spread outward like ripples in water. "I should have said this sooner," he continued, opening the box with hands that betrayed none of the storms he had weathered but all of the vulnerability he had buried. "You saved my life, my ranch, everything I have left. I don't know what I would have done without you, so don't let me find out. Marry me." And for a brief, fragile moment, everything seemed to hold still, as if the world itself was waiting for her answer. But the woman in front of him didn't react the way he had imagined during countless nights staring at the ceiling, rehearsing this exact moment in his mind. Instead of recognition, there was confusion, her brows knitting together slightly, her lips parting not in surprise but in uncertainty. And the longer she stayed silent, the more something cold and unfamiliar began to creep into Ethan's chest, a doubt that hadn't existed seconds before but now refused to be ignored, until she finally spoke. Her voice careful, almost apologetic. "Sir, I think you've made a mistake." And just like that, the moment shattered, the silence around them no longer charged with anticipation but thick with awkwardness. Whispers starting up again at the edges as Ethan slowly stood, his mind scrambling to make sense of what he'd just heard. "You're not Clara Whitmore?" he asked, the question sounding wrong even to his own ears, because how could she not be? Everything matched, everything lined up, but before she could respond, before the confusion could deepen or be explained away, another voice cut through the tension from behind him, steady, grounded, and carrying a weight that made him turn instinctively. "No," it said, "she's not." And when Ethan turned, the world shifted again, because the woman standing a few steps away looked nothing like the one he had just proposed to. Not polished, not composed. Her clothes marked by travel and work, dust clinging to her boots, hair pulled back without care for appearance. But her eyes, there was something in her eyes that hit him harder than recognition. Something familiar in a way he couldn't immediately explain. Sharp and unwavering. Like someone who had been watching everything unfold with a kind of quiet patience. And before he could ask, before he could even fully process what was happening, she met his gaze directly and said, "I am Clara Whitmore." And in that single moment, with the ring still open in his hand, and an entire station watching the aftermath of a proposal gone wrong, Ethan Cole realized that the story he thought he understood, the woman he thought he knew, the future he had just tried to claim, had all been built on something he hadn't bothered to question. The woman he had just proposed to stepped aside quietly, eager to disappear from the growing tension. But Ethan barely noticed anymore, because his attention was locked on the second woman, the one who had just claimed the name that had carried him through months of struggle. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the noise of the station fading into the background as the truth settled between them. "You're Clara Whitmore?" Ethan asked, his voice no longer steady, and the woman gave a small nod before adding, "Not exactly. Clara Whitmore is my sister. My name is Mara." And the words hit harder than he expected, forcing him to rethink everything all at once. Then the letters, the help, all of it? He pressed, and she answered simply, "Mine," without pride or hesitation, just a quiet certainty that made it clear she wasn't trying to impress him, only to state a fact. And Ethan ran a hand through his hair, tried to catch up. "Why would you do all that for me?" he asked, and Mara's expression shifted slightly, something more serious settling in her eyes. "Because I owed your father," she said, and that stopped him cold. "Years ago, when our ranch was about to fail, he stepped in and saved it. Never asked for anything in return," she explained, her voice calm but firm. "I don't forget things like that." And for a moment, Ethan just stood there, absorbing the weight of a debt he hadn't even known existed, realizing that everything he had managed to hold on to wasn't just luck or timing. It was her, working quietly in the background, making sure he didn't lose everything. "You could have told me it was you," he said after a pause, and Mara shrugged faintly. "Would it have changed anything?" She replied, and the truth was, he didn't have an answer, because she was right. He had never questioned it, never looked beyond the name he was given, and now that realization sat uncomfortably in his chest. "The ranch is still standing because of you," he said instead, more certain of that than anything else. But she shook her head slightly. "It's standing because you didn't let it fall. I just made sure you had a chance." And there it was again, that distance she kept from her own actions, as if none of it really belonged to her. And Ethan found himself studying her differently now, seeing not the image he had built in his mind, but the person who had actually been there all along, unseen, unrecognized, and yet essential. He glanced down at the ring still in his hand, the symbol of a moment that had already gone wrong, and let out a quiet breath before looking back at her. A faint, almost self-aware smile crossing his face. "I guess one thing's clear," he said, and Mara raised an eyebrow slightly. "What's that?" she asked, and he held her gaze as he answered. "I proposed to the wrong woman." And this time, her expression shifted, just slightly, but enough to show that, despite everything, this mistake might not have been the end of the story after all. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the shum of the station fading into the distance as the last of the passengers drifted away, leaving behind only the creak of wooden boards, the soft clatter of a loose sign in the wind, and the quiet aftermath of a moment that had gone very, very wrong, and yet somehow didn't feel like an ending. Ethan stood there with the ring still in his hand, no longer rushing, no longer certain, but seeing things more clearly than he had just minutes ago, while Mara remained a few steps away, her posture steady but her expression harder to read now, like she was already preparing to leave before anything could complicate what she believed was already finished. "So that's it?" he finally asked, his voice calmer, grounded in a way it hadn't been before, and she gave a small, almost indifferent shrug, her eyes drifting briefly toward the empty tracks. That was always the plan. Your ranch is safe. You're back on your feet. There's nothing left for me to do here, she said, as if everything she had done, the letters, the money, the quiet decisions that had kept his life from falling apart, could simply be folded away like it never mattered. But this time, Ethan didn't accept that so easily, because now he understood what had really been standing behind his survival, and more importantly, who. You don't actually believe that, he said, stepping closer, and Mara's gaze snapped back to him, a flicker of resistance crossing her face. Believe what? She asked, her tone sharper now, defensive in a way that told him he had touched on something real. That this was just about a debt, he replied, holding her gaze. Maybe that's how it started. But that's not how it ended. And for a brief second, she didn't respond, the silence stretching just enough to reveal the truth she wasn't saying out loud. I did what needed to be done, she said finally, but the words lacked the certainty they had carried before, and Ethan shook his head slightly, not dismissing her, but refusing to let her reduce everything to something so simple. No, he said quietly. You did more than that. You stayed. You paid attention. You knew things I never told anyone, and you fixed them before I even realized they were problems. And as he spoke, he could see it in her expression, the way her guard shifted, not breaking, but no longer as solid as it had been when she first stepped onto the platform. People don't do that for a debt, he added, softer now. And this time, Mara looked away first, her jaw tightening slightly as if she didn't want to give his words more weight than they already had. You're reading too much into it, she muttered, but even she didn't sound convinced, and that was when Ethan glanced down at the ring in his hand again, the symbol of everything he had gotten wrong just minutes earlier. And instead of frustration, he felt something else entirely, clarity. He closed the box slowly, the soft click echoing louder than it should have in the quiet space between them, and when he looked back up, there was no rush in him anymore, no need to force a moment into something it wasn't ready to be. I made a mistake, he said, and Mara let out a faint breath, almost as if she expected him to say that, but he shook his head slightly, correcting himself. Not the one I thought. And that caught her attention, her eyes narrowing just a little as she studied him more carefully now, as if trying to understand what had changed. I thought I knew who I was building something with, he continued, his voice steady, honest in a way that didn't try to impress or persuade. But I didn't. I built it on a name, on an idea, he admitted, then paused before adding. Turns out, the person who was actually there the whole time wasn't the one I was looking at. And for the first time since all of this began, Mara didn't deflect, didn't interrupt, didn't brush it aside. She just listened, and that alone shifted something between them. You're not what I expected, she said after a moment, her voice quieter now, less guarded, and Ethan let out a small breath, a hint of a smile forming despite everything that had happened. Yeah, he replied. I'm starting to figure that out myself. And for a second, there was something almost light in the air between them, something that hadn't been there before. Not tension, not confusion, but possibility, fragile and unspoken. And Mara looked at him a little longer, before glancing once more toward the tracks, like she was weighing something internally, something bigger than just whether she should stay or go. I don't make promises, she said finally, her tone steady but no longer distant, and Ethan nodded, accepting that without hesitation. Good, he said, because I'm not asking for one. And that seemed to surprise her, just slightly, enough for the corner of her expression to soften in a way that hadn't happened before. And in that moment, with no crowd left to watch and no expectations left to meet, the truth of it all settled quietly into place. Not with a grand gesture, not with another proposal, but with something far more real, because as they stood there side by side, no longer strangers and no longer hidden behind assumptions or borrowed names, Ethan understood something he hadn't seen before. He hadn't just made a fool of himself by proposing to the wrong woman. He had been given a second chance to recognize the right one. And this time, he wasn't going to rush past it.